I'd like to start this discussion on a positive note, because a lot of the stuff we need to talk about is tough to talk about. The U.S. still has, by far, the most powerful, largest, and most innovative economy in the world. This is GDP per capita, fancy words for how much does the average American make. The answer is just shy of $50,000. That's average. Which puts us well ahead of Germany, the UK, and Japan, other industrialized nations that we often compare ourselves to, that are 15,000 or so per person below where we are, and well above what they call the BRIC countries, the rapidly developing countries of Brazil, China, and India. China, because they've got 1.5 billion people, actually has the second largest economy in the world, but on a per capita basis, $7,400, we remain the most innovative and powerful economy in the world. Why? A couple of answers right here. We've got 100-year-old companies that are fortunately still in business and doing well, and we've got companies like Google that didn't exist 25 years ago. Innovation, employing people. This is now one of the largest companies in the world. Nobody had heard of it 25 years ago. GE, boy, did we talk a lot about GE this weekend. We can talk more about that if you like, but obviously the news stories have brought them front and center. Boeing, world beater on aircraft. This is a good thing. However, there are at least two things that are starting to show cracks. One is, and I don't need to tell a Fairfield County audience this, but the infrastructure, the roadways, the railways, the airports, the ports that allow us to move goods and services and people are crumbling. And again, I don't need to tell you this. You spend time on 95 and on the Merritt, you know what an impediment that is to growing business here in Fairfield County. We are now spending 2% of our gross domestic product, of our economic expenditures on infrastructure, while China spends 8%. Now, China has a lot of catching up to do, but we are spending roughly 1/3 of the levels that Western Europe is spending, such that the World Economic Forum now ranks our infrastructure as number 15th in the world. And that can't continue to be true and also have us remain the #1 economy in the world. Another form of infrastructure, really important, Pete. I almost feel more strongly about this one. Companies like Microsoft and Google, innovative companies, biotechs, new clean energy companies get started because we have thoughtful, innovative people. And that is a function of our education. And here too, a generation ago we had the highest high school graduation rate in the world. We had the tops on math and science scores, patents, Nobel laureates, all that stuff. We are now in the pack. Here we are, yellow and blue. Yellow is reading scores and blue is math scores. We're kind of on the average of industrialized countries. We're having our lunch eaten by the students of Shanghai in China, and we're getting beaten on these things by Japan, Germany, Finland, Canada, just to give you a few examples. That too cannot be true and have us be the #1 economy in the world. This is something we need to address. The challenge, of course, is we are now carrying very substantial levels of debt. This is our federal debt, which right now stands at $14.1 trillion as a percentage of our GDP. We are at levels that we have not seen. It's not on this chart, but we were here once before in 1946 after World War II. The point is, this is where we are today. You see it kind of leveling off, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But we don't have a lot of extra money sloshing around to address the infrastructure and education investments that we know we need to make. Pete? Even more concerning, you're all worried as I am about the $14.1 trillion in debt that we are carrying. Here it is. We actually have some bigger issues. Those are the unfunded liabilities, which is a fancy word for the promises that we have made to people alive today of benefits in the Social Security, the Medicare, and the Medicaid system. What we have promised the child who was born today over their lifetime and everybody else alive today in the Medicare system is almost $32 trillion. That's an unfunded liability. We have not reserved against it, but we have made those promises. It's not debt. We don't owe it to anybody, but the present system has promised me, you, my kids, this value of services out of Medicare, and this value, $8 trillion, in Social Security. Now, I want to talk about these for a second. This is debt we have to repay. We've taken on these obligations, we have to repay it. Unfunded liabilities, of course, can be reduced if we fairly and carefully and smartly reform the Medicare and Social Security systems. We've done it. By the way, Social Security is by far the smaller problem here, $8 trillion. And I want to be very clear on this. Unfortunately, both parties demagogue Social Security. They try to scare seniors. Your benefits are going to be cut. The Republicans want to privatize it. The Democrats are going to drive it into insolvency. We've fixed Social Security before. 1983, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill come up with a deal that kind of makes everybody a little unhappy. You raise the retirement age a little bit, that makes some people unhappy. You raise the cap on which wages are withheld, that makes other people unhappy. But the point was, we've done this before and we know how to do it. And we can do that without in any way affecting, and I want to say this very clearly, any current recipients or anybody who's even close to being a recipient. There are no proposals to cut benefits for Social Security. The deal would be, I'm 44, maybe you start with my generation and you say the retirement age on you is going to be just half a year later or a year later, and by the way, the cap on which wages are withheld is going to go up a little bit, just the way they did in 1983. This is much more complicated. The unfunded liabilities in Medicare. Much more complicated, much larger, because of course it relates to the fact that for as long as anybody can remember, healthcare costs have been going up 15%-ish every single year on average, and that is very, very hard to change. Pete? So, a couple more slides here. Here's the deficit, not debt, but the deficit. And it's important for us as we think about what we need to do to understand how we got into the stratosphere here. If you look back to 1980, which is when this starts, Ronald Reagan is newly elected president, you see that over his presidency we actually run deficits that are not low, but are certainly nothing like what we've seen here. There's actually an interesting story here. Ronald Reagan is elected president, cuts taxes, the deficit begins to go up. Senator Pete Dominici shows up in Ronald Reagan's office and explains to him the very significant, at that point, increase in the deficit. And Ronald Reagan, in the latter part of his term, raises taxes, and we begin to see those deficits come down. We see that under Clinton here, for a couple of reasons, chiefly we had a very robust economy in the late 1990s, and he raised taxes. We see that we have a surplus in the economy. Then, 2000, we as a country decided to do a couple of things. We decided to go to war in Iraq. We decided to go to war in Afghanistan. The cost of those things now are $1 trillion and counting. We added a drug benefit to Medicare, Part D, without sort of coming up with a tax to pay for it, and so we began to run deficits there. It's great. Seniors love the drug benefit in Medicare, but it costs something. And we began to run, and in 01 and 03, we substantially reduced taxation to the point that today, at the federal level, the tax rate on average that the country pays federally is lower than it has been since 1958 when Eisenhower was president. We're paying about 18% of our GDP as federal taxes. And it has varied over time between 18, 19, 20, 21%, but we're at the lowest point in terms of receipts because of the 01 and 03 tax cuts. And then, of course, the recession hits. The biggest recession that anybody who doesn't remember 1930 or 1929 has ever seen. And when a recession hits, this is true of Connecticut, it's true of the federal government, your tax receipts go way down. People have lost their jobs, they're no longer paying income tax, and in fact, maybe they're using unemployment, maybe they're using Medicaid, maybe they're using other safety net services. And so when the recession hits, we begin to see very large deficits. Included in here is the $800 billion that was spent for the stimulus. This little bar here represents the expenditures for the TARP program. This was the most politically unpopular thing the federal government has ever done, I think, which, well, maybe that's an overstatement, but one of the most politically unpopular thing that the federal government has ever done, effectively bailing out financial institutions. What you need to know about that, like it or hate it, and we should all sort of be very uncomfortable with the idea that the government bails out anybody, that money has now been just about fully repaid. So some of the expenditures that were made here for the TARP have actually come back in. And at the end of the day, we are going to get our money back on that in full with some return. These are estimates for the deficit that begin to come down, even if we do no hard things, because again, the economy is recovering, so we're seeing revenue rise and safety net expenditures come down. Next slide. If you remember nothing else from this presentation, I think this is my second to last slide, this is the key. This is where the federal government spends its money. These are expenditures. Defense, it's about a quarter. And by defense, I mean military, CIA, NSA, all the intelligence, all the Department of Homeland Security. It's about a quarter. Here we have non-security discretionary. This is everything else. The court system, the FAA, the investment in education, transportation infrastructure, everything else is in this 13%. A little more than half of what we spend on defense. This little sliver, I just pull it out for fun because, you know, people, the one cut that achieves more than 50% support amongst the American public is foreign aid. Fine, let's have that discussion, but let's also remember that it's about 1% of our overall budget. The point I'm trying to make here is that we are having a deeply dishonest discussion in Washington right now about the budget because we are talking about how much to cut in this little piece of the pie. 13%. The Republicans are saying cut $61 billion at last count, and the Democrats are saying cut $20 billion. And I don't know, the answer is somewhere between those two numbers. But my point is that the only way we fix this problem is if we're looking at the whole pie. Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, to his credit, has said you have to cut defense spending. This is something new and very positive for this country. The politics of this used to be that when a Democrat said let's cut defense spending, the Republicans would say he's weak on defense. The problem is now severe enough that everybody is saying we're going to have to find efficiencies and cuts to make in our defense apparatus. So this argument that we're having about how much we cut all of this stuff is playing in a very small slice of the budget. Turns out the only part of the federal budget I vote on is this roughly 40%. This is interest payments, and by the way, this slice gets much larger if we don't get our deficits in order over time. You don't get to vote on that, or you do in the debt ceiling, and we can talk about that if you want to. But all of this is mandatory spending. This is outlays for Social Security. This is Medicare, Medicaid. These are things that are automatic. And by the way, I told you that nobody is proposing near-term cuts to benefits. We are not going to say to people in Social Security, your check's going to be smaller. So you can fix this, but you can't use it to help fix next year's deficit, because again, nobody is going to say to a Social Security recipient, we're going to cut your check back. We talked about Medicare. My point is simply this. The right answer here is something like what we saw in the proposal that was made by the President's Debt Commission. SimpsonBowles. Many of you will be familiar with it. It was a proposal that was a committee that was led by Senator Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, who was in the Clinton administration, Democrat and Republican, that said exactly that. You got to deal with the whole pie. And they made some proposals. They made some significant proposals for cuts to discretionary security and non-security spending. By the way, they also said, don't make those cuts this year, make them next year. Because if you make those cuts this year, there's some chance you're going to tip the economy back into recession. I know we'll talk more about that, but they said do it next year. They also looked at Social Security and said exactly what we did in 1983. You can tinker with some of the levers and that'll make this thing sustainable in the long run. They punted, frankly, on Medicare. They said figure out how to reduce health care costs, right, which is a little bit of a punt on Medicare. And then they said with respect to the tax code, simplify it. Get rid of the loopholes and the deductions and everything. Get rid of a world where, just to prompt the discussion that I know is coming, where GE can pay almost no taxes because they've got a 900-person, I'm making that number up, tax department that just goes through a very complicated tax code and takes the second highest corporate tax rate in the world and reduces the actual tax down to 0%. Simpson-Bowles said, just simplify. Lower the rate, expand the base. All of this, they found $3.9 trillion in savings over 10 years. They envisioned that the 01 and 03 tax cuts, which were extended for 2 years last December in that compromise, they envisioned those fading 2 years when the law says that they fade. Now we're going to have a big fight over that in 2 years, but I will just point out to you that if the Bush tax cuts are extended permanently, the cost of that over 10 years in terms of foregone revenue is almost exactly what all the Simpson-Bowles savings add up to. It's about $3.9 trillion. So you can say make them permanent, but then you also got to say, what do we either cut or where else do we get that $3.9 trillion? Last slide. This is where I am. I'm your representative. You deserve to know what I think about this. I am not unique, but relatively in the minority in the House, in that I'm on record, and I'll tell you, Simpson-Bowles, which I discussed here, has some ugly stuff in it. I'm happy to tell you. Frankly, everything in it is a little uncomfortable to talk about it. If it came before the House, I would vote for Simpson-Bowles, because it is the one plan that addresses that whole pie. And so I think we do need to develop that kind of plan. If I have an opportunity to negotiate within Simpson-Bowles, fine, I'll do it, but I would vote for it. We cannot, this is where I am, some may disagree, make cuts that are so profound right now when our economy is recovering, but slowly and haltingly, that we tip the economy back into recession. Look at the UK. The UK promulgated a fabulously intense austerity budget that cut their federal spending by about 25%. Economic growth in the UK in the last quarter was about half a point less than what was expected. So this is a real issue. How much and when and where we cut. Don't cut at a speed that causes us to tip back into a recession. And lastly, let's not forget, this takes me back to the first two slides. Let's not forget that if we continue to underinvest in our system of education, in our infrastructure, we're not going to have the kind of prosperity that yields the robust economy that will allow us to, over time, be sustainable.